Learning is an important topic in psychology. Learning is especially important in behaviorism. Behaviorism, they devote their full attention to the topic of learning. Learning is a lasting change in behavior as a result of experiences. There are two pieces of learning that are essential. Number one, there must be a behavior change. Suppose I get a speeding ticket today, and tomorrow I continue to speed. I get another ticket. There's no learning in this aspect of my life because I don't show behavior change. If there's no change in behavior, there's no learning. Experience is also a big part of the learning process. Suppose I used to be able to run marathon, but because of injury, I stopped running. I had to stop running marathon. And that's not learning. I did have a behavior change, but the behavior change was not caused by experience. I had no learning experience. In order to understand the process of human learning, we need to take several different approaches. Behaviorism talks about conditioning, classical conditioning, and operant conditioning. Social psychologists talk about social learning or observational learning. We learn by observing other people. We learn by imitating role models. There's also insight learning and abstract learning. Let's start with the behaviorism. Behaviorism had contributed two principles of learning. One is called classical conditioning. The other one is called operant conditioning. Classical conditioning, these are two stimuli becoming associated with each other, and they come to produce the same response. Let's look at the example. Let's look at the example of the original study conducted by Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov, he was a Russian physiologist. His specialty was studying digestions in animals. Animal digestions, this is an autonomic process. It's controlled largely by the autonomic nervous system. Part of the digestion is salivation. When you see food, when you taste food, salivation occurs automatically. Animals have little control over their salivation when they see food. Pavlov showed dogs food. Every time he showed the dog food, the dog would salivate. Pavlov collected saliva from the dog's mouth and measured the amount of salivation. Salivating to food is autonomic, and it is a reflex. It is a physiological process. However, when Pavlov rang a bell, and see if the dog would salivate, the dog would not salivate. There was no salivation response. Pavlov would not be collecting an increased amount of saliva. When he rang a bell, the bell ring was neutral to salivation. It does not produce the response of salivation. It was neutral to the salivation response. Then Pavlov found a way to train the dogs to salivate every time he rang a bell. He would ring the bell first and then show food. Ring the bell, show food. Ring the bell, show food. He repeated this process multiple times. And then When he just rang the bell, the dog would salivate. The dog has learned a new response, that is, salivating to the sound of bell. This is behavior change, and it's caused by experience. Before the conditioning process, when the dog heard the bell, there was no salivation response. The bell was neutral to salivation. However, the presence of food and the taste of food would always create the salivation response. Every time you show the dog food, the dog would salivate. The food is unconditioned stimulus. The salivating response to food is automatic. It is unconditioned. Food is unconditioned stimulus. It produces unconditioned response of salivation. Dogs do not have to learn to salivate every time he sees the food. It is automatic. During the conditioning process, the neutral stimulus, the bell ring, is associated with the food, the unconditioned stimulus. And after continued association, repeated association, the bell would acquire the ability to elicit the salivation process. After the conditioning, ring the bell, the dog would salivate. Now the bell changes. The bell ring is no longer neutral to the salivation process. It becomes a conditioned stimulus. The dog has learned to salivate every time he hears the bell. Salivating to the bell is a learned response. It is called a conditioned response. This is a process for classical conditioning. Food is unconditioned stimulus. It produces unconditioned response automatically. The bell becomes a conditioned stimulus, and it acquires ability to produce a conditioned response. Conditions means that it must be learned. Certain conditions must be met in order for the dog to produce the response to the conditioned stimulus. The condition that must be met is the learning process, is association process. Ring the bell, show food. Ring the bell, show food. Repeat multiple times. Here are the key concepts of classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, you have the unconditioned stimulus. This is the stimulus that elicits innate reflexive response, automatic response, a learned response. Food in the mouth, or even the sight of seeing food, is unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned response, that is the reflexive response or automatic response produced by the unconditioned stimulus. Salivation to food is unconditioned response. Salivation in response to the sight of food or the taste of food is unconditioned, unlearned. Conditioned stimulus, a good example is the sound of the bell to salivation. Before the conditioning process, the sound of bell would be a neutral stimulus. It does not produce the unconditioned response, that is salivation. But after repeated conditioning experience, the bell would be able to produce salivation. Now the bell becomes a conditioned stimulus. Salivation to the sound bell is a conditioned response. It is learned. This response occurs to the conditioned stimulus, the bell ring, as a result of the paired presentation of the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus. This would be the bell, and this would be the food. The original Pavlov theory of classical conditioning emphasized contiguity. Contiguity means closeness in time, temporal association between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, the bell ring and food. First of all, usually the bell ring must go first. Ring the bell and then show food. Ring the bell and show food. And this chart shows the stimulus intervals between the bell ring and food. Zero interval means simultaneous. Ring the bell, show food, ring the bell, show food at the same time. When there's no interval, when there's no gap between the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus, the animal does not show strong learning. The vertical axis shows the strength of the conditioned response, how strongly the animal salivates in response to the bell. You have to wait a little bit. Ring the bell, wait a little bit. Half a second, wait half a second. This would produce the most powerful conditioned response. If you wait for longer periods, say if you wait for 1 second, ring the bell, wait for 1 second, and then show food, the learned response becomes weaker. And the longer you wait, the larger the interval between the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus, the weaker the learned response. In other words, the bell ring must precede food, and the gap must be small. These two things must happen in close, very, very close to each other. This is contiguity principle. And later on, more cognitive-oriented psychologists believe that the learning mechanism is not just contiguity, it's not just closeness in time, it's contingency, it's expectations. If you ring a bell and show food, ring a bell, show food, this kind of experience would produce expectancies. The animal, the dog will expect that every time there's a bell ring, food would follow. In other words, the conditioned stimulus come to become a predictor of unconditioned stimulus. The bell predicts food will follow shortly. This is more cognitive or psychological understanding of the learning process. This was the original animal research conducted by Ivan Pavlov on classical conditioning. In the 1920s, John Watson, the American psychologist, adopted the classical conditioning principle to investigate human behavior and human emotions. He was interested in showing the classical conditioning of phobias and fears. Watson and his assistant conducted a very unethical experiment or study on a little child, a 9-month-old baby, little Albert, little boy. They divided the study into 3 stages. The first stage would be the pre-testing or the testing stage. They tested little Albert's responses to animals, small animals. They showed him a rat, white rat. Little Albert was not afraid of a rat. He was trying to touch it, trying to play with it, no fear. At this stage, rat was neutral, a neutral stimulus with respect to fear. It does not produce fear responses. And they wanted to know what kind of stimulus would scare little Albert. They showed him a rat, no fear. They showed him a rabbit, no fear. They showed him a poodle, a small dog, no fear. They showed him a fur hat, fur coat, no fear. Little Albert was just not afraid of furry animals and furry stuff. Then they made a loud noise. They took a hammer and banged the hammer on a metal pipe, made a sudden loud noise. Now little Albert got scared. He would cry every time he heard the loud noise. And then they went to the second stage, the training stage, or the learning stage, or the response acquisition stage. They paired the loud noise with the rat. They would show the rat and bang the hammer, show the rat and bang the hammer. Every time little Albert see the rat and hear the loud noise, he would cry and try to crawl away. That was acquisition stage. They repeated the pairing of the rat and the noise multiple times. And then they threw away the hammer. They wanted to test the learning result, the outcome of the learning. They just show the rat. No loud noise, no hammer. Every time little Albert see the rat, he would cry, he would be scared, he would try to crawl away. Little Albert is showing a behavior change. His response to the rat changed. Learning has occurred. He had acquired a new behavior, a new response, that is the fear of the rat. This shows that fear can be learned through classical conditioning. In this study, the rat initially was a neutral stimulus. It would not produce a fear response before the learning process. The loud noise had always been the unconditioned stimulus. It always automatically produces crying, attempting to crawl away, the unconditioned response. In the conditioning process, the rat, the neutral stimulus, became paired or associated with the loud noise that was unconditioned stimulus. They tend to occur in close temporal intervals. Show the rat, make loud noise. Show the rat, make loud noise. Every time these two things happen together, little Albert will show the unconditioned response, crying, attempting to crawl away. After the conditioning process is completed, the rat by itself would produce the fear response, the crying, the escape behavior. The rat is no longer neutral now. It becomes a conditioned stimulus. Now it has the ability to elicit or produce a conditioned response. That is fear, crying, escape behavior in response to the rat. This is a process of how fear can be learned. John Watson started the complete process of classical conditioning, fear conditioning. In the acquisition stage, the rat was paired with a loud noise. The conditioned stimulus was paired with unconditioned stimulus. And then after the conditioning is complete, the conditioned stimulus, the rat would be able to produce the response, the conditioned response, fear of the rat. And then there's also generalization of the conditioned response. After the training period, Watson showed little Albert rat, little Albert cried. Watson showed him a bunny, a rabbit, little Albert cried. He showed little Albert a poodle, a small dog, little Albert would cry. A fur hat, a fur coat would make little Albert cry. Little Albert was only conditioned with the rat, not with the bunny or the fur coat or the little dogs. But the response become generalized from the rat to all similar stuff, similar animals, furry animals. This is a generalization. And this process might be able to experience some kind of a phobia development or learn of being fearful to certain situations. For example, a child might develop a phobia of the classroom or school and refuse to go to school by classical conditioning. Before, at the very beginning, say we have a student, Jenny. Jenny is an international student, and she came to Canada to attend high school. And when he first arrived, the first day he went to school, he was not afraid of the classroom. I mean, she was okay with the classes. That was the initial stage. The classroom, the school environment was neutral with respect to fear. It would not produce fearful responses in Jenny. And that was the initial stage. And then there was a traumatic experience. Jenny went to her English class. She became a target bully. She got bullied, she got ridiculed, and she got harassed by some mean students. Now, the classroom environment would become paired or associated with the bully and associated with a fearful response to the bully. The bully, the harassment, the radical, those kind of treatment would always be the unconditional stimulus. So this kind of treatment, these experiences are negative. They always produce fearful responses in Jenny. After the acquisition stage, Jenny would be afraid of the classroom. When she goes to the classroom, there's no bully. Even when there's no bully, even when there's a this is in a friendly environment, he would still feel fearful. This is a result of the classical conditioning. Now the classroom has become a conditioned stimulus. It produces the conditioned response of fear. The next stage would be the generalization. After the traumatic experience, Jenny might develop a fear of the classroom, but not only one classroom, not only the classroom where she got harassed, the English class. When she goes to the math class, she would feel afraid. When she go to a social class, she would become afraid. She would generalize the fearful response to similar situations. She might even generalize a fearful response to all school, the school setting, the school environment. Even getting close to school every day would create a fearful response in her. She might be afraid of going to school. This would be the response generalization process. The classical conditioning theory may be able to express some fearfulness. Some fear responses are indeed learned through a classical conditioning. For example, if a person get traumatized, get attacked in a dark alley, she might associate the dark alley with fearful responses and become afraid of dark alleys. Not only the original dark alley where she got attacked, but dark alleys, back streets of different types in different areas. Here, the unconditioned stimulus would be the attack, the trauma, the harassment, the bugging. And the conditioned response, the conditioned stimulus would be the environment, the dark street, the narrow street, the alley, and the unconditioned response is the fear response to the unconditioned stimulus, which is the attack, the harassment. The conditioned response would be the fear to the dark alley. This conditioned response could generalize to similar situations. All little streets, dark alleys would be able to create and elicit fearful responses. Later on, behavior research developed more complete understanding of the process of classical conditioning. The acquisition stage is important. This is a learning stage. In this stage, the conditioned stimulus is paired with unconditioned stimulus. Ring the bell, show food, ring the bell, show food. And the animal or the human being will be learning the response. The conditioned response will become stronger and stronger. Now, if you ring the bell, keep ringing the bell, no food. If you present the conditioned stimulus alone without the unconditioned stimulus, the response will become weaker and weaker. You ring the bell, no food. At the beginning, the dog will be producing a lot of saliva. But then gradually, ring the bell, no food, ring the bell, no food. The salivation will become weaker and weaker. Eventually, it will disappear. This process is called extinction. The conditioned response will go into extinction, provided the conditioned stimulus is not accompanied by the unconditioned stimulus. And then there's a spontaneous recovery. Suppose you ring the bell, ring the bell, no food, ring the bell, no food. The salivation to the bell will disappear. But if you wait wait overnight, come back tomorrow morning to the lab, and then if you just ring the bell, the salivation response will return. This is spontaneous recovery of the response. But the recovery is weaker than the original learned response. The spontaneous recovery will keep appearing, but will get weaker and weaker until there's a full extinction. The extinction process is very important for therapy, for treating fear responses in people with phobia problems. Suppose if you want to give little Albert therapy, help him overcome the fear of rats that he had learned, how would you do that? This did not happen in the real world. After Watson did the study on little Albert, he lost track of the little boy, and he never was able to give the little bird any treatment or therapy. Based on the principle of extinction, one of the possible therapies for treating the learned phobia would be exposure. If you present the conditioned stimulus alone, again and again, the conditioned response would go into extinction. In other words, show the rat, no loud noise. Show the rat, no loud noise. Expose the boy to the white rat with no loud noise. At the beginning, little Albert will be crying, showing a lot of fear, but the fear response will become weaker and weaker and disappear. And then after waiting a certain period of time, maybe overnight, if you show the rat again, the fear will return. That is a spontaneous recovery. But the spontaneous recovery will be weaker than the original learned response. And then if you give little Albert several sessions of treatment over a long period of time, eventually the fear of little white rats will disappear completely. This is a principle of exposure therapy. This therapy can be used to treat people with a specific phobia. Claustrophobia is a fear of enclosed places, small places, elevators, small rooms, tunnels. These situations create a strong response of fear in people with claustrophobia. Exposure therapy would expose these people to the feared situation. At the beginning, the person will be very fearful, have strong reactions of anxiety, but gradually, the fear response will subdue, will go away by process of extinction. Eventually, if the exposure is long enough, it will be able to successfully eliminate the condition. That is based on the extinction principle. Research also have demonstrated some subtleties and complexities in the classical conditioning. One subtlety or complexity is a Garcia effect, and it's related with a taste aversion. Garcia and his associates gave rats some novel food, feed the rat with some food it never tasted before. And then they waited an hour, sometimes more than an hour, and then made the rat throw up, nauseated, or vomit. And they gave the rat medication used for chemotherapy, and the chemotherapy medication make animals ill, nauseated, and vomit. This long interval, the interval between the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus, the sickness and the hurt is long, but the rat still learned. Next time, if you offer the rat the food, he will reject the food. He will feel nauseated. He will be feeling ill. And this is different from the original contiguity theory. It's not just a temporal closeness. Seems that animals can figure out, they have a natural tendency to associate a sickness with food. Even this long wait period, even when there's a long gap of time between the sickness and something that they ate, they would still be able to make the connection between the two stimuli. It's biologically prepared. Another part of the Garcia effect is distinction or discrimination. At time one, you give the rat three stimuli. One is sweetened water, sugar water is related with food and eating. And then at the same time, you would flash a light. A light would be on. You play a tune at the same time. These three stimuli are given at the same time. Then you divide the rats into two groups. One group, you give them shock, electric shock to the food. It's painful and it's uncomfortable. The other group, you make them ill. You make them throw up and make them vomit, nauseated. What would they learn? According to the original contiguity theory, both groups will learn to avoid all three stimuli. All three events would be associated with the avoidance response. But Garcia and his associated found something different. They found out if you make the rats ill, they would avoid the water. And if you make, they will not be avoiding the light and the tune. If you make them ill, make them throw up, next time you offer them the food, the water, the drink, they would not take it. They would feel ill. But when you play the sound, the tune, or flash the light, these rats will be okay. They will not be running away or escaping or trying to hide. However, in those rats who got shocked, they would avoid the light, the tune. They would try to run away, avoid, but they would not avoid the water, the taste of food, the taste of food. They make discriminations, they make distinctions. If they have nauseated feelings, they try to associate, they tend to associate it with something they ate or drank. And if they had shocked, had pain experience, they associate it with lighting and sound. That's discriminative conditioning. Here is a summary of classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, you have two stimuli getting associated with each other. One is a previous neutral stimulus, that was the bell, and it becomes associated with a particular response, that is physiological or emotional response. And it's being paired with a stimulus that does not produce that physiological response. Yeah, let me explain this again. The classical conditioning, the learning occurs between two stimuli. One stimulus is the neutral, the previous neutral stimulus. This would be the bell ring before the conditioning to the dog. The bell previously would not produce salivation. And this stimulus is paired with a stimulus that produce the response. That would be the food. The food would always produce the salivation response. The food and the bell, these are associated. The bell is associated with food. And then the bell would come to be able to produce the response, the conditioned response. The response being learned is automatic, emotional, or physiological. It's like a salivation, that's physiological response. Emotional response, fear, little Albert's fear of the rat, will be emotional response learned to the rat through conditioning. previous neutral stimulus become associated with an unconditioned stimulus, and then the neutral stimulus would become conditioned stimulus. It will be able to produce the response. This would be the bowel, the food, and salivation. We have discussed the classical conditioning. That was one of the major principles of learning discovered by behaviorism. Another part of the behaviorism, or another important principle of learning in behaviorism, is operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is all about reward and punishment. Operant conditioning, this line of research started with a law of effect discovered by Thorndike. Thorndike built a puzzle box, and he had a hungry cat serving as his subject. He would lock the cat up in the cage, in the puzzle box, and put food outside. The cat would try to get out. At the very beginning, the cat would use trial and error. He would try do different things, like scratching, mewing, making a lot of noise, knocking on the cage. Those actions would not produce good results. And then by accident, the cat pulled the rope and the door opens. The cat gets out. Now, Thorndike would catch the cat and lock him back in there again. He would lock the cat in there multiple times, up to 50 times. And he would record how long it would take the cat to get out. At the beginning, it took a long time for the cat to get out. The cat would be trying different things, different actions. And then after locking the cat up multiple times, it will take a shorter and shorter time for the cat to get out. What is happening? The cat stopped doing the ineffective things. It would stop mewing, stop scratching, stop knocking on the cage. Those actions are not rewarded. Unrewarded behavior tend to discontinue, but rewarded behavior tend to appear again and again. Pulling the rope, this behavior is rewarded. So the cat keep doing that. Every time you lock him up, he would pull the rope right away. And that would reduce the time it takes for the cat to get out. This is a law of effect. Animals learn the consequences of their behaviors, and they change their behaviors according to what they learn about the consequences. B.F. Skinner, he was the psychologist who refined our understanding of operant conditioning. He divided behavior consequences into two broad types. Reinforcement increases a behavior in the future. Punishment decreases a behavior in the future. Reinforcements come in two types, positive and negative. Positive reinforcement, that is giving the animal something he wants. Giving the animal something that makes him happy. Like food is a typical positive reinforcement. Food, mating opportunities, water. And then negative reinforcement, that is removal of painful stimulus. Take away something that the animal does not want. This is also rewarding. Negative reinforcement is very important for maintaining some undesirable behavior. For example, if I have a social phobia, if I feel anxious every time I go to a classroom, going to the classroom would produce anxiety. Anxiety is very punishing. It's very uncomfortable. It's disturbing. And then I leave. That action, leaving and escaping from the classroom, remove my anxiety. My anxiety gets better, a lot better. That is negative reinforcement. This negative reinforcement will make me more likely to do the same thing next time if I feel anxious in the classroom. And this kind of negative reinforcement will maintain my negative behavior of escaping and avoidance. Both positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement would increase the probability of a behavior. Punishment decreases the probability of a behavior. Positive punishment, that means you give the animal something that he does not want. Give him negative stimulation. Pain is a typical negative stimulation. That is a positive punishment. Negative punishment is taking away something the animal wants, take away food. And in human beings, if a child does something undesirable, if the child beat other kids or fight with other kids or destroy properties, the parents might administer negative punishment, take away his video game, or take away his cell phone, take away his favorite toys for a certain period of time. That would be negative punishment. Positive punishment would be giving the person or the animal painful stimulation, like beating, physical punishment. That would be positive punishment. Positive does not mean good. Here, positive means presence or present. Negative means absence, taking away. Skinner did very detailed studies on the different ways of providing reinforcement and punishment. He studies different reinforcement schedules. He was using a computer to program the schedule of the reinforcement. Food is very important reinforcement for hungry animals. If you want to train the animal to press a lever or to perform certain actions, you give him food as a positive reinforcement. He tested different reinforcement schedules. One schedule is continuous reinforcement. Continuous means that every time the animal does the right thing, press the bar, you gave him food. Every time he presses bar, you gave him food. That is continuous reinforcement. Another type is fixed interval reinforcement. Interval means time period. You divide, so suppose you study the animal for 1 hour, you divide the 1 hour into maybe 6 intervals, 10 minutes per interval. Altogether, you have 6 intervals. And the reinforcement, the reward is based on each interval. At the end of the first 10-minute interval, if the animal does the right behavior within the 10 minutes period, you give him a reward. And then the next interval, you wait until the end of the interval to give the reward. That is fixed interval reinforcement. In human life, we have a lot of these kind of arrangements. Salary. Suppose if you get paid every other week, that's a fixed interval reinforcement schedule. The interval is 2 weeks, and you get reinforcement only at the end of the 2-week interval. If you go to work, if you keep showing up for your work. And then there's also variable interval reinforcement. This is a situation where the interval changes. Sometimes the intervals are unpredictable. A good example would be good weather. Weather is unpredictable. Good weather. How often do we get good weather? Sometimes you have to wait for 1 week to get a couple of days of sunny weather. Sometimes you have to wait only 1 day. You get good weather every other day. The intervals of reinforcement of good weather changes. It's not fixed. That's variable interval reinforcement. Another type of reinforcement schedule is fixed ratio. Ratio is a ratio, 1-to-1 ratio, that'll be continuous reinforcement. 1-to-1 ratio means that every time the rat presses the bar, press the level, he gets reinforcement. The ratio between the response and reward is 1-to-1. But then you could get a 1-to-2 ratio. That means that every 2 times, every other times, the animal does the right thing, you give him one reward. So sometimes in the human workplace, we have bonus systems. For example, if you get a bonus for every 10 cell phones you sell, that would be a fixed ratio schedule. The ratio is 1-to-10. You get 1 reward for every 10 cell phones you sell. The ratio is fixed, 1-to-10. Then there's a variable ratio schedule. The ratio varies. Sometimes you get 1 reward for every 10 attempts. Sometimes you get 1 reward for every 2 attempts. The ratio is changing. Gambling is based on this kind of arrangement. Suppose you are playing the slot machine. Sometimes you keep trying several times, but no reward, no winning. And then sometimes you keep winning on every try. The variable ratio schedule produce persistent responses, even after the reward stops. Even after the reward reinforcement stops coming, the person will still continue to do the action. That's why gambling can be highly addictive. Once the animal starts to do the desired action, you can reward him with food, with positive reinforcement to keep the action going. But how would you make the animal do the right thing for the first time? When you put the pigeon in the cage and you want him to peck on the key, he doesn't know, the pigeon doesn't know. Once he starts pecking on the key, you can reward him by giving him food. But the first good behavior, good desirable behavior is hard to come by. How would you help the pigeon learn that? The slow way would be trial and error. You wait, a hungry pigeon will be pecking around all over the cage. By accident, he might be pecking on the cage, and then you reward him immediately. This be trial and error. There are faster ways. One faster way is shaping. Shaping would mean that you put pigeon in the cage. If he walks towards the key, you reward him. When he stands in front of the key, you give him some food, and then you increase the difficulty of the task. Now, he has to peck around the key to get food reward, and then you increase the difficulty. Now, pecking around the key is not good enough. You need to peck on the key to get a piece of food. This way is approximation, it's a gradual approximation toward the good behavior or the desirable behavior. This is called shaping. Shaping is used to improve human behaviors quite often. Suppose you have a child who has difficulty sitting through the class, highly distractible, and move around a lot during class time. You could use a shaping to help him modify his behavior. At the beginning, you would make him sit in the class for 10 minutes and then reward him. And after he's comfortable doing that, you will increase the difficulty. Now, he has to sit in the class for 15 minutes to get the reward. And then after he's comfortable doing that, you make him sit in there 20 minutes to get the reward. You get closer and closer to the desired behavior. That is shaping. The take-home message from the operant conditioning research is that animals learn the consequences of their behaviors. They approach reward and they avoid punishment. They try to terminate punishment by trying to figure out the right actions. Seligman did an extension to operant conditioning research. He was interested in the situation where the animal cannot find the right action to stop painful stimulation. What if animals suffer from inescapable pain? He did an experiment with dogs. Dogs were divided into two groups. One group suffered from escapable shock. You shock the poor dog, it's painful but not lethal, but the dog can do something to terminate the shock. The dog may press the nose button to stop the shock. The shock is escapable, but some other group of dogs, they suffer from inescapable shock. They get shocked. There's no way they can turn off the shock. No coping mechanism. They always get shocked. And then what are the consequences? In the second part of the study, you subject all the animals to escapable shock. You put them in this shadow box. You shock them on one side. There's a divider in the box. For those dogs who had suffered from escapable shocks, they were active. You shock them here, they would jump over and escape to safety. And then if you shock them on this side, they will jump over to the other side. They are actively coping. They try to improve their situation. But those dogs who had suffered inescapable pain, they would not cope in the next stage. In this stage, if you shock them, they would lay on the floor and scream and cry, but they would not move. They would not even try to escape. Seligman calls this situation learned helplessness. In other words, the dogs who had suffered inescapable shock, they learned that they were helpless. There would be no response that would allow them to escape the pain and improve their situation. The dogs in the inescapable shock group, they learned that they were helpless. This condition is very similar to depression or reactive depression. when people suffer from long-term traumatic experience, this kind of experience may lead them to believe that they're helpless. There's no effective mechanism or no effective action for them to improve their situations, and they become passive and they become depressed and they give up, basically. They become hopeless. They may even become ill. They may even develop some stress-related disorders. Now let's summarize the two conditions: operant conditioning versus classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, we're dealing with physiological and emotional responses. These responses are innate and unlearned. In the Pavlov study, the response was salivation. That's part of a digestive response. This is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. It's automatic. And fear in little Albert, that was emotional response. It was also innate and reflexive. But in operant conditioning, we're dealing with voluntary responses, voluntary behavior that can be controlled by the animal or the person. Pressing a bar, that is voluntary behavior. And then there's also difference in the association learned. In classical conditioning, the animal or the human would learn the association between different stimuli. Pavlov's dogs will learn the association between the bell and food. Little Albert will learn the association between the rat and loud noise. Operant conditioning. Through operant conditioning, we learn association between the behavior and its consequences, outcome. The rat will be learning press the bar, that's going to be food, or press the bar, that can be water. The rat might also learn that if you press the bar, you will get shocked, so stop doing that, stop pressing the bar. Conditioning is a type of associative learning. You associate different stimuli with each other. Non-animals, mammals, and primates, they engage in associative learning. They figure out that one thing follows another thing. Another kind of associative learning is imitation or social learning, observation. Animals observe other animals and copy their behavior. Human beings make use of imitation all the time to learn new behavior, new skills, new abilities. Social learning was popularized by Albert Bandura. That's observational learning. He did a really popular study. His participants were kids from kindergarten. He was teaching at the Stanford University, and he went to the university kindergarten and did a study on the kids. He showed them a role model. A model, this adult is beating a life-size doll, the Boo doll. The adult model is beating the doll with a hammer, kicking the doll and punching the doll. And Bandura would want to learn that would the kids watching the model copy the behavior? He divided the kids into two groups. One group watched the model be aggressive, perform the aggressive actions, and got rewarded by a teacher. A teacher would give the model positive feedback for his aggressive behavior. On the other hand, A second group will watch the same aggressive behavior in the model, but then watch the model being punished, being reprimanded, being scolded by a teacher. Bandura found out the group that watched the model being rewarded for the aggressive behavior, they copied the aggression. They imitated the model to a greater degree than those who saw the model being punished and reprimanded. In other words, kids are observing the consequences of the models of behavior. They are encoding certain behaviors getting rewarded and certain behaviors getting punished. They only imitate the behavior that got rewarded in other people. We can analyze the study design of the Bandura social learning research. All kids watch model hitting the life-size doll, and then there are two groups, two treatment conditions. One condition, the kids watch the aggressive model being praised by a teacher, that's reward. The other treatment condition, the kids watch aggressive model being reprimanded, being punished by the teacher. This would be the independent variable. The independent variable is a consequence of the model's behavior. And then the dependent variable is the kid's behavior, kid's imitation. The kids will have a free play session with the doll. The researcher would record how many times they would copy the aggressive model's behavior of aggression. This would be a neat experimental design. Bandura used this line of research to demonstrate the social learning of aggression. Aggression can be rewarded by direct reward. Direct reward is that the person experiences the reward him or herself. Indirect reward is that you may learn by observing other people being rewarded or punished for the behavior. That is social learning, observational learning. In the social learning or observational learning, you have a model, you have a role model demonstrating the behavior, and then you have imitators. The observer would imitate the behavior, rewarded for the model. Advertisers use this strategy all the time. And they use cool people to show off cars, clothes. They try to associate using a particular product with reward. Using an Apple phone is associated with being cool and being admired by the role model. Social learning is different from behaviorism. Social learning depends on cognition. Behaviorism is direct reward, operant conditioning. In operant conditioning, the person, him or herself, gets rewarded. But in social learning, you need to observe. You need to observe other people. Oh, the role model, he was aggressive and he got punished. And then you encode that in your mind. You try to apply it in your behavior choice, decision-making process. I'm not going to beat other people up because beating other people up will lead you to bad consequences. You get into trouble with the law. And you saw that in some prisoners, and you heard about those cases. That's observational learning or social learning. Albert Bandura has come up with a comprehensive model of human behavior. He believed that the situation, behavior, and personal processes influence each other. each piece would influence the other piece in a two-directional way. Behavior would include approach, avoidance, helping, etc. Behavior would be interaction with personal processes like people's goals, beliefs, emotions. And then the situation would be influencing these two pieces in a reciprocal way. There are some nuances in conditioning, in learning, in behaviorism, and social learning. Here are some key concepts. One concept is higher order conditioning. Higher order conditioning, one example of higher order conditioning would be that one example of higher order conditioning would be you train the dog to salivate to bow. You ring the bell and show food, ring the bell, show food. And you only ring the bell, no food, the dog would salivate. But then you can have an extension of this process. And so you can kind of, you use the bell as a conditioned and as a higher order condition is a concept sometimes hard to understand. The APA dictionary gives a really good intuitive definition. For example, if you pair a tune with food, you play a tune and you show food. Play a tune and show food, and then the tune will be conditioned to stimulus. You play the tune, the dog salivate. You play the tune, the dog salivate. And then you can use the tune, the sound, as an unconditional stimulus in the next study. Now you flash a light, you play tune. You flash a light, you play a tune, the tune. And now every time you flash a light, you show the light, you turn on the light, the dog will salivate. The light is a higher order conditioning. Another concept is discriminative conditioning. Discrimination is opposite to generalization. If you train the dog to salivate every time he hears a tune, and you can train him to salivate to a very particular tune, only a tune with particular pitch will be paired with food. Tunes with other pitches will not be paired with food. And then the dog will salivate only to that particular tune. That is discriminating. The dog can differentiate between different pitches of the tune or the sound and selectively respond to the correct pitch sound. That is discriminative conditioning. Another nuanced concept is primary reinforcers versus secondary reinforcers. These are related with operant conditioning. When we are talking about positive reinforcers, it could be primary or secondary. Primary reinforcers are reinforcing in themselves. Food is primary reinforcer. Food is rewarding in itself and by itself. Secondary reinforcers are not reinforcing by itself. Money is a secondary reinforcer. Money is a piece of paper. It doesn't, you can't eat it, but you can buy food with money. And then we talk about continuous reinforcement schedule versus partial reinforcement schedule. Continuous reinforcement be rewarding the animal or the person every time he does the right behavior. Every time the rat presses bar, you give him food. That is continuous schedule. Partial reinforcement include fixed intervals, variable intervals, fixed ratio, variable ratio. Those are partial schedule reinforcement schedules. Another concept is contiguity versus contingency models of classical conditioning. The contiguity model believes that if two things happen close in time, they will produce conditioned response. If the bell and the food are really close in time, ring the bell, show food, ring the bell, show food, the animal will learn to salivate to the bell. The contingency model believes that expectations are necessary. What dog learns is a new expectation. When I hear the bell, I'm expecting food is on the way. That is contingency model. This is more cognitive understanding of classical conditioning. Another subtle concept is latent learning. Latent means hidden, not obvious. And this line of research depends on reward and punishment. Let me show you another PowerPoint. In the biological chapter, we talk about rats learning to run mazes. How do you know that the rats have learned the maze? How do you know? How do you test? How do you show that the rats have learned to master the contours and remember the structure of the maze? One way you can observe is their behavior. And you have to give the rats reward. Reinforcement is necessary for the rats to improve behavior. You make the rats run through the maze, and when he's successful, you reward him with food. He will run faster and faster. Takes less and less time, make less and less mistakes in running the maze. But if you don't give him reward, if you don't reward him with food after he finishes running the maze, he will not show improvement. He will be taking the same amount of time, even after several trials. Make him run the maze, just wander around in the maze for 10 times, he will not improve. He has now no motivation to run faster. And then even when he's not showing improvement, is he still learning? Is he learning some new information? Tolman believes that the rat is still learning even when he's not showing behavior improvement. He showed that by, suppose you gave the rat 10 trials without reward, he will not show improvement. On the 11th trial, you start rewarding the rat. Once you start rewarding the rat, giving him food every time he finishes, he will improve very fast. He will be showing dramatic improvement now. That means that before you gave him reward, the rat already learned. The rat already got familiar with the environment. That was a latent learning. Latent means that the rat learned to build a cognitive map about the maze, but he did not show it in behavior. By observing the speed and accuracy of the behavior, you will not be able to see that he learned anything. That's latent learning. The mirror neurons, this concept is related with observational learning, with imitation. Imitation, these motor neurons are really a recent discovery in the cognitive neuroscience. Apparently, there are some neurons in the brain that respond to other people's behavior. This is a model. When the model is making a movement, certain part of the brain would have neural activities increased. And these observers, when the observers observe the model making a movement, the same areas of the brain, the same neurons of the brain would be activated just by watching, just by observing the model. So these neurons are mirroring or reflecting what's going on in the model's behavior. This is really facilitative of learning, help you learn. If you are moving your hands, certain part of your brain's neurons would light up, fire faster, and the same neurons in my brain would also fire faster. There's a resonance, there's a reflection, there's a symphony going on. This is really important for learning other people's behavior by observing them. That's the mirror neurons, really new findings. The last page of the PowerPoint would be some information for summary for your review. You can look through these tables and then to get a better picture, get a better mastery of the key concepts covered in this chapter.